Hello and welcome back to episode 6 of our TM Soup to Nuts video series. In today's episode, we'll be looking at the financial part of the process, which will include looking at the cost distribution concept, which is important for you to understand what it is, how it works, what the options are afforded to you to influence how the cost distribution is going to work, how it's going to help you understand which of the goods that you ship are the most onerous in terms of cost from a freight transportation point of view. We'll also be looking at how you can, if you so wish, copy the freight charges that have been incurred on the freight order back to the billing documents that you'll be issuing to your customers. And lastly, we will be looking at the carrier settlement process, which deals with paying your carriers for the transports that they executed on your behalf. So without further ado, let's look at the theory first, and then we'll jump into the system to actually keep on going using the example from our freight order where we left off in the previous episode. So without further ado, let's just jump right in. Before we jump into the system, there's a couple of topics that we need to cover off from a theoretical point of view. As you might have seen, whenever we saved a freight order, there was a message appearing that would state that the cost distribution had occurred. And the cost distribution is a very important aspect of the entire process, because what it aims to do is to look at the costs that have been aggregated or accrued against a freight order and distribute them back to the delivery and sales order items that were transported on that particular freight order. But before we look at the cost distribution, we must also have a basic understanding of charge calculation. To be more specific, the scope with which a charge can exist in a freight order charge management process. In SAP TM, the freight order can have a certain number of charges recorded against it, pertaining to the weight being transported, insurance charges, loading charges, fuel surcharges, and each one of these charges is going to apply at a different level, meaning that there are some charges that will apply at the freight order level, so independent of the number of stages or number of products being transported, it will be a charge that is applied to the entire freight order, and that is what we call technically the route level. Charge could also apply at a stage level, so a stage being that portion of a trip that is between a source and a destination location, and the last kind of charge that we could have could be one that applies at a product level. And these elements of route, stage, and product are known as calculation resolution base, i.e. the basis for resolving a charge calculation. So let's move on to looking at the cost distribution and a basic example to kind of explain what it's all about and how it works. So here we have an example of a freight order that is going from a source destination to a first stop at one customer location and will then go on to another final destination. So there are two stages on this particular order, and we can also see that this freight order is carrying two products. We have one product which totals a weight of 100 kilos, and the charge calculation at the product level has determined that the cost of transporting those 100 kilos is $100. We also have another item on this freight order, and again we have a charge calculation that has worked at the product level and has determined that to transport these 150 kilos of that product, the charge was going to be $150. So we have these two charges that are applied at the product level. Now, if a charge is applied at the product level, then it's easy enough to, via the document flow, understand to which delivery and which sales order that product is associated to. And in this case, from a cost distribution point of view, it's easy to say, well, seeing as this product is being transported on behalf of this sales order, it's only natural that the cost that is applied at the product level should be distributed back to the sales order. And that's what we see here. We see that this product, which weighs 100 kilos, generated a freight charge of $100, and those $100 are being distributed back to the delivery and sales order that generated or to which this product is associated with. In the bottom part of the screen, we have a similar scenario in the sense that we have this product that weighs 150 kilos, which generated a freight cost of $150. And again, we have the ability to uniquely identify and link this product with this delivery and this sales order. Hence, we are distributing the entirety of that freight cost for that product back to the delivery sales order that this product is associated with. But at the freight order level, we can also see that we have a charge of $110. So this is where the question comes in to say, well, what do we do with these $110? How do we distribute those $110 back to the sales orders that were transported in this particular freight order? And in this case, what we are doing is we are doing a cost distribution on the basis of the gross weight of the products that were transported. Hence, what we are saying is that the product that weighed the most should incur the greater portion of those $110. So technically how that works is that we are going to add obviously the 100 kilos from here and the 150 kilos from here, which amounts to 250 kilos. And 100 kilos is 40% of 250 kilos, and 150 kilos is 60% of 250 kilos. So that is the same proportion with which we are going to apportion the $110 costs back to the sales orders. So we're taking the $110 cost on the freight order level, and then to assign it back to the sales order, we're saying, well, this particular sales order item amounted or accounted for 40% of the total weight that this freight order transported. Hence, 40% of those $110 should be pushed back to this sales order here. Similarly, we're doing the same thing for the second item, which amounts for 60% of the total weight that was transported. So 60% of the $110 should then also be apportioned back to this sales order here, which is the one linked to that particular product. Meaning that from a cost distribution point of view, what is happening is that we've got $144 being distributed back to this sales order, and that's split across the $100 that came from the product as well as the $44 that came from the 40% of the 110. And similarly for the second item, we are going to be distributing a total cost of $216 back to that sales order, and that can be accounted for by the $150 that came from the product and the $66 which corresponded to the 60% of the total weight carried by this freight order, and hence 60% of those $110. So hopefully that's kind of explained how the cost distribution works. And that is going to be of importance because we are going to be wanting to pull those freight charges back to the billing documents that we are going to raise against those two sales orders. And it should only be fair that the apportionment is done in a fair way so that this customer pays his fair share of the transportation costs, and likewise this customer pays for his share of the transportation costs. So that's the whole point really of the cost distribution. And what is also worth noting is that whilst we may have a certain number of freight charges against a freight order, as indicated here, could be to account for freight, insurance, loading charges, fuel surcharge, etc., etc. When those charges get pulled into the billing document, they are going to be funneled, if you like, into one charge. So this could be n number of charges, but on the billing document, they will be pulled, aggregated into just one charge. Now, I've been saying here that the cost distribution was done on the basis of the gross weight. And you might ask yourself, well, is that the only method possible in TM? And the answer is no. This is just one of several possibilities. And if you want to configure a different cost distribution basis more suited to your needs, then you would need to go to the configuration side of the house, so manage your solution or the CBC. And what you want to find is the SSC UI ID 104374, which is called Define Charges Profile. And this Define Charges Profile is going to lead you to this entry here, and there is only one that is available to you. And in the distribution profile value, this is what is going to determine how the cost distribution happens. As you can see here, in my current setting, it is set to a order delivery item distribution by gross weight, but you could also do it based on the net weight or the gross volume or the distance times the weight. So you've got these four options there to influence how the cost distribution is going to happen. So now that we've covered those theoretical basics, let's just jump into the system and pick up where we left off to see how the settlement is now going to work. Okay, so now that we're back in the system, we could at this point already be looking at the raising of the billing documents, and we would already now at this point be able to see the charges being copied from the freight order into the billing document. However, we will first go through the accrual posting because I do want to show you the cost distribution that is going to be available there, which is hopefully going to provide some more clarity to understanding how the whole process works. So if you recall, in the previous episode, we left it at where we had a freight order, we had done the event tracking against it, we had completely executed it, meaning that we had picked up the goods at our distribution center, delivered the goods at our customer locations. So that freight order was, from an execution point of view, done and dusted. It was finished. You also remember that once we had reached the checked out status at the source location, at the distribution center, the freight order was already at that point available for posting. This was the order that we had used, and you can see the cost distribution status is saying successful, meaning that the freight order costs have been correctly distributed to the sales order items and deliveries that are being transported in this particular freight order. We can also see that the freight charges amount to a total of $251.56. So let's quickly go into that freight order and look at the charge calculation. And let's open up the charges box. I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so we've got a bit more real estate to see what's happening here. So what we can see is that we have different charges that were applied to this particular freight order, which helped us to result in that total freight cost of $251.56. Now, we're not going to delve in too much into the charge calculation aspects because there will be a separate episode on freight agreement and charge calculation and charge types. But what I do want to show you here is that which we touched on a bit earlier on, which is the calculation resolution base. And what we can see here in this particular freight order is that we have some charges that repeat. So we have a basic rate, we have an insurance, we have loading charges, handling charges that repeat 4 times. And this is due to the fact that we have 4 products, 4 items being transported on this particular freight order. So this is maybe already an indication that we have some charges that are being resolved at the product level. If you recall from the start of the presentation, we said that we have charges that can apply at the route level, at the stage level, or the product level. And then here at the bottom, we've got a couple of charges that only occur once. So let's look at basic rate. And if we go down the screen, what we can see here is that for this basic rate, some of the details are indicated here. So there's a rate amount of $0.04 that has been picked up. we have a rate currency, and we have a calculated amount of 3.60. So that already tells us that this rate, which was picked up, has been multiplied by something, and in this case it's the weight, which amounted to a total freight cost of $3.60. We can also see a logistical reference. So already this is also kind of telling us that this charge is referencing this particular item, which is item 60, and PRTG11, which is a product code, a material code. We can also see here information pertaining to the agreement, the freight agreement that was picked up, and the rate table that helped us to determine this particular rate. Another piece of information that I quickly want to show you and look at is this here. It's the calculation resolution base. So again, this is what we explained at the beginning of the episode, which is that the scope of a charge can be at the root, at the stage, or product level. So this particular charge is being applied at the product level. Let's have a quick look at another one, which is the surcharge. And what we can see here for this charge, we can see it's applied at the root level. So we have two examples of charges that are directly at the product level. So 100% of that $3.60 cost is going to be distributed back to the order delivery that this product is associated to. But for this surcharge, which is at the root level, we are going to need to distribute the costs based on the gross weight amongst all of the products that are transported on this particular freight order. So let's get out of this freight order. Okay, so now that that has been covered, we can go on to the next step, which is performing the accrual posting. Now, the accrual posting is an important step because once it has been posted, obviously it's going to, as the name indicates, generate an accrual, which is going to be that trigger, that sign, that indication to your accountants that they are going to see those costs appear in the company books. So once you are into the accrual posting, the thing that you might want to do, which I generally recommend is a good practice, is to at least diagonally go over to the freight order details indicated there, just to make sure that everything checks out. In particular, you would not want to miss having a purchasing group. So if you find that there is some information missing, go back to the freight order, update it, and then come back here. All right, so what we're going to do is go to the cost distribution, which, as I said, is hopefully going to help us better understand how all of the costs were distributed. So most of what I discussed at the beginning, you can find here. So again, at the freight order level, we can see that the total freight cost amount is $251.56. But we've also seen that some charges have been applied at the product level and some charges have been applied at the freight order level. So bearing in mind that we have this total cost, if we drop down to the distribution hierarchy, we can see here a distribution percentage. And what this is telling us is that 27.1% of those $251.56 were distributed to this outbound delivery. Let me open this up a little bit so we have got a bit more room. There we go. So we can see that 27.1% of that total cost was distributed to the outbound delivery 356 item 10, sales order 917 item 20. We can also see that 32.2% of that cost was distributed to this delivery and this sales order item, and so on and so forth. So we've got the distribution percentage as well as the distribution amount, and we also have here the quantity, which is of course important because if you recall, we've set the distribution to be based on the gross weight. Now let's open up the first item here, which is PRTG12, and that will give us even more information regarding a further breakdown of those 27.1% or $68.2. And what this is telling us is that we had an insurance fee percentage, which is this charge type, which was distributed 100% to that delivery and sales order. So this is telling us also, this is an indication telling us that this particular insurance fee charge was at the product level. Again, we have also a loading charge, which was obviously applied at the product level. There was a handling charge, but the charge was 0, so it did not apply. And then we have a freight flat rate. And here we can see that the percentage is 32.1%, meaning that this was one such charge that was applied at the route level, at the freight order level. And this is where a distribution based on the gross weight did happen. And what we did was we distributed 32.1%, which equated to $32.09 to that delivery and sales order. Let's open this up to see a bit more. Let's go to another item, and again here we have the same kind of information, so telling us that we have charges that were applied 100%. Now we can see that in this case here we did have a handling charge of $16, which we did not have for this item here. So we had the $16 that were applied 100%, so again a product level charge, and we have a freight flat rate, which again is that route, that freight order level charge that was distributed based on the weight to our delivery and sales order. So hopefully this gives you that level of detail to really understand how the cost distribution has worked. Okay, so now that we have checked all of this, and actually what we'll do, because the next step that we are going to be checking out is the raising of the billing document. So we can see here that we have item 20 of sales order 917, and we should be getting a charge of $68.20 being copied to the billing document when we are going to be raising the invoice for this particular order delivery. So let's have a quick look at order 917, item 20. And we'll go and quickly look at item 20. We'll look at the conditions. And what's interesting here is you can see that we don't have that $68 freight charge anywhere. The only thing that we really have is just the basic product price of $30 times 5 units, $150. And there's also a tax amount, but we don't have any freight charges available here. However, if we look at the analysis of the pricing procedure, we should here find this charge type ZTRA, which again, if you recall, is that charge that we created in one of the very first episodes of the TM Soup to Nuts series. And we will find this charge being applied in the billing document. So again, just wanted to highlight that at this point here in the sales order, we don't have that charge being indicated. All right, so we're back in the accrual, and as I said, what we are going to do now is we're just going to say confirm for posting. And we can see that the indicator here is that everything went well, and what has happened now in the background is that the system has generated a service entry sheet as well as a purchase order. And if we refresh the document and then we go to the document flow, here we will find the document flow having been updated with the service entry sheet. So there's 2 service entry sheets, but this was cancelled and then reprocessed. So the service entry sheet 20 has been generated when we confirmed the posting. Let's go back. What we should also see in the app here is that from a posting point of view, nothing is to be processed because we've just done it, but we have the freight order 58 clearly being shown as having been posted. All right, so now that we have posted the accrual, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go and raise the billing document for one of the outbound deliveries. And what we will do is we will raise the billing document for the sales order 917, which is the one that we just looked at. And in order to do that, we will need to pick the corresponding delivery, which is this one indicated here, which is 356. So we're going to select our delivery. Let's quickly check our billing settings. Okay, and we're just going to say create the billing document. So we want to create the billing document for that delivery. And what we'll do, so we have 2 items, and if we go and look at the items, we'll go and look at this first item here. And what we should see is we should see a ZTRA, here we go, which we see here, ZTRA of $68.20, which is exactly what we saw in the cost distribution. So this shows how the freight order costs can be pulled from the freight order into the billing document that we are now going to be presenting to the customer. So of course, if you're happy with everything that you can see in the billing document, then we can simply say go ahead and save it, and that will then close the process with the customer. So for that customer requirement, we generated a sales order. In the sales order, we indicated that the sales order was going to be handled via TM, which generated the freight unit. We planned the freight unit to a freight order for which we created a delivery, and the costs associated in the freight order have been distributed back to the delivery items, sales order items, and have been pulled now into the billing document. So that covers the settlement process from the customer point of view. So I'm just going to get out of that, and I'm going to come back here. So the next thing that we can do is we can look at the service entry sheet. And if you recall, when we posted the accrual, we looked at the document flow, which indicated that the service entry sheet number 20 had been generated. And already here in the service entry sheet, we see a lot of information. Obviously, I've got my service entry sheet number, but I can also see here the purchase order that has been generated in reference to my service entry sheet. And we can also see here in the name of the service entry sheet, this is more FYI, the freight order number to which the service entry sheet and purchase order are referenced against. And why is this important? Well, in this particular process, and as I said earlier on, from a settlement point of view with the carrier, you essentially have 2 choices. You can either go down the path of a self-billing process, meaning that you are in effect raising the invoice on behalf of your carrier and you're going to pay him directly. Or the other method is to generate the service entry sheet and purchase order, wait for the carrier to send you the invoice, and then you do a normal invoice verification process. So what we can do here is we can actually look at the purchase order. So we'll go to manage purchase orders, and where in the billing document we only had 1 charge, which was ZTRA. So all of the freight charges that had been recorded against the freight order were clubbed into just 1 charge ZTRA. In the purchasing side of the house, it's a very different story. And what I mean by a different story is that we have the same level of detail as that which we had in the freight order in the purchase order. The difference is that in the freight order we had charge types, and in the purchase order we are using materials, service materials. And again, if you recall, in one of the very early episodes of this series, we did go through a process where we had a batch job that allowed us to, for each of the charge types that we are going to be using, to also generate a corresponding material. And that's what we see here. So for the basic rate that we had in our freight orders, we are now using material, service material 144 to account for that basic rate charge. Similarly, we find the insurance fee, the loading charges, and so on and so forth. So we have a 1-for-1 level of detail in the purchase order as that which we had in the freight order. And that's probably something that you want, right? Because when you are going to be receiving the invoice from your carrier, it is going to have that same level of detail, and that has been driven from the freight agreement, which was in effect a mirror image of the actual contract that you established with your carrier. So the next thing that we want to do is we are going to be receiving the invoice from the carrier, but the carrier doesn't know what this purchase order number is or service entry sheet is, because indeed these objects have been purely generated so that we can accommodate the invoice receipt. Now the carrier, the only thing that he's going to know is the freight order number. And that's exactly what we are going to also use when we do the invoice verification. So let's have a look at that process. And so for that, we go to the Create Supplier Invoice application. We're going to enter some of that basic information that we need to put in there. As a reference, I'm going to paste simply the freight order number. And to process the incoming invoice, we are not going to be using the purchase order, but rather, as I said, we will be referencing the freight order, which is what the carrier is also going to give us in terms of information. Then I'm going to simply paste in the freight order number. I'm going to enter the amount that is indicated on the invoice. I'll do a quick check. It's telling me that everything is successful. And if we look at the details of the incoming invoice, we can see that we have that same detail as that which we had in the freight order, in the service entry sheet, and the purchase order that was generated for the service entry sheet. Namely, we have the detail at the product level, the basic rates, the insurance charges, as well as the charges that were generated at the freight order level. So once we're happy with all of this, we can simply post our invoice. Here we go, supplier invoice has been generated and we're good for the day. So that concludes the financial part of the process. So we've seen the cost distribution, we've seen how we copied the charges from the cost distribution from the freight order into the customer billing document, and now we've also seen how we can process the carrier settlement where we generate a service entry sheet purchase order, wait for the carrier to send us his invoice, and we pay against the invoice. Now, one last thing that I also want to quickly show you, and that is going back into the Manage Your Solution app, making sure that we're in the right country. Looking for supply chain, sub-application, transportation management. And if we look at this particular section here, transportation cost settlement, you have this particular setting here, which is assign integration settings to charge types. So we'll quickly go into the configuration of it. So to understand how we go from the charge types that we have in the freight order to having those charges also duplicated into the purchase order in the procurement process, this is where really the magic is going to happen. So we have the charge types as we have them in the freight order. We have the valuation class, and you might be wondering, well, why do we have a valuation class here? And again, if you recall that process where we generated service materials for each of the charge types that we want to track, this valuation class is going to be appended to the service materials that would be created. So if we looked at that particular material, I think it was 144 for one of the charge types that had been generated, we would probably find in there the valuation class 3450, which, as you know, is also then in the account determination going to drive what GL account is used in the account assignment of the purchase order. And then here we have the condition type, which are purchasing condition types. So the charge type SD01, as an example, would result in the creation of a service entry sheet purchase order with an account assignment that has a GL determined against that valuation class, and the charge that would be associated with the service material in the purchase order would be against a charge type PMP0 in the purchase order. Well, there you go. This was really looking at the financial settlement part of the process. I hope it was insightful. It has given you the information that you need to understand what the cost distribution is about, how it works, what the levers that are at your disposal are to influence how it's going to work, the option that you have to also copy the charges back to your customers' invoicing documents, your billing documents, and then of course look at the carrier settlement, which is paying your carriers for the work that they did on your behalf. That said, we are not quite finished yet. We still have quite a few topics to cover before we can call it a day. In the next episodes, we will be looking at the freight agreement, which is also an important part of the entire process as it deals with the charge calculation that happens in the freight orders. We'll look at the options that are available to you, how you can structure your freight agreements, i.e., do you want to leverage rate tables independently of the freight agreement or local rate tables within the freight agreement, and then we'll see how all of this binds together when you actually trigger the charge calculation in the freight order. We'll also be looking at the analytical reporting part of the process, because it's all nice and well to be executing on those transports, but it's also nice to be able to take a step back from all of that to analyze what is actually happening in your transportation world. So until next time, stay safe. We hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.
My dance make it hurt.